So Freud starts chapter 4 by addressing the elephant in the room. If all dreams are wish fulfillments, why do so many of them feel painful, scary, or just plain nonsensical? Why do we have nightmares? Why do we dream about failing exams or being chased by monsters? How can these possibly be things we wish would happen? Well, his answer is kind of brilliant. Some of our unconscious wishes and desires are so unacceptable or threatening to us that they can't appear in dreams exactly as they are. So instead, the mind reshapes them into something safer. And it's often so altered that it looks nothing like the original desire. That's why even a nightmare can still be a wish in disguise. Freud calls this dream censorship. And Freud is essentially proposing that we have two psychological systems at war with each other. So one system, the unconscious, generates wishes, desires, impulses. The other system, what he calls the preconscious or conscious mind, acts as a censor. But here's the clever part. During sleep, this censorship system is partially at rest. Now, it's not completely asleep, but at rest enough so that some of our more distressing thoughts are able to sneak past the censor in disguise. They put on costumes, speak in code, and transform into symbols. Ultimately, upon waking, the dream we do remember, what Freud calls the manifest content, is the disguised version of the wish that made it past the censor. The real wish, the latent content, is hidden underneath and needs to be analyzed and dissected the way an English professor decodes symbolism and metaphor in classical literature. I used to love those guys. I had one English professor who was so great at that. Anyway, so this is where Freud drops one of his most clever analogies and where I had a whoa, this actually makes a lot of sense. So here's what Freud does. He compares dream censorship to political censorship. It's kind of like how a writer living under an authoritarian regime has to disguise dangerous or controversial ideas that the government does not want its citizens to be exposed to, and how those writers are able to communicate those same ideas through symbolism and metaphor. Freud says that's analogous to how our dreams have to disguise forbidden wishes and distressing desires to get past our own internal censorship. So when I first read this, something totally clicked. I immediately thought of Sergio Corbucci and his spaghetti westerns. Now stay with me here. I'll explain what I mean. So Corbucci was a communist filmmaker working in post-fascist Italy. He couldn't make films that were explicitly critical of globalization, Western capitalism, or the Italian government that was in power back then when he was making films. The government censors just wouldn't allow it. So he had to find a way to sneak in the themes and social commentary he wanted to convey in his films. The films he ended up making, like Django and The Great Silence, are full of anti-fascist and anti-capitalist symbolism. The costuming, like characters in red hoods or scarves, those were intentional choices to symbolize oppressive groups and regimes, like the fascists or the KKK. This was all deliberate by Corbucci and the writers to critique the very systems that were censoring their creativity in reality. So since Corbucci couldn't say what he wanted directly, he said it through literary techniques, such as genre, metaphor, and symbolism. And I think what's really interesting is that a lot of people would argue that the censorship didn't weaken his message, and that it actually transformed it into something more powerful and artistic. And that's exactly what Freud is saying about dreams, that our unconscious mind is like Corbucci. It has things it desperately wants to communicate to us, but our internal censor won't allow the raw, unfiltered version to get through. So instead of showing us directly, it stages an elaborate production. The dream becomes a kind of underground cinema of the mind, where forbidden thoughts sneak past the censor, dressed up as something else entirely. A train isn't just a train. It might be a disguised sexual wish. But here's the thing. And this is important because I think a lot of people gloss over this. It's that these aren't universal symbols, like those dream dictionaries we've all seen. You can't just look up a symbol to see what it represents, because it's going to be different for everyone. These symbols are personal, shaped by individual experience and association. So if I have a dream where I'm in a graveyard and I see a statue of Napoleon, that's going to mean something very different than if you had a dream where you were in a graveyard or you saw a statue of Napoleon, because those symbols and objects likely mean different things to both of us that are based on our prior lived experiences. So Freud gives us the perfect example of this from one of his own dreams. And this one is one of his more famous and kind of ridiculous case studies. Okay, so in real life, one of his patients, a married woman, comes to him and explains that she just had a dream that was about to prove his whole theory wrong. She basically comes up to him and says, "Look, Freud, I had a dream where I wanted to give a supper party, but I couldn't because I didn't have enough food. How is that wish fulfillment? It's literally the opposite." Okay, so here's what her dream was actually about. She wants to have her friends over for dinner, or in old time talk, a supper party. But anyway, the only food she has in her house is a little bit of smoked salmon. And she only has a little bit. It's not enough to feed everyone. And she can't go buy more because all the shops are closed. So in the dream, she has to cancel her plans to host the dinner party. Okay, so at first glance, that sounds like she's onto something, right? Like, what kind of wish is that? You dream about not being able to do something that you really want to do? I mean, if dreams are supposed to fulfill our wishes, why would anyone dream about being unable to do something that they want to do? And Freud even says as much in the book. He writes, "It seemed like the reverse of wish fulfillment." Okay, so here's the thing. Remember earlier when we talked about how symbols and dreams mean different things to different people? Well, okay, so you see in this case, Freud knew this woman fairly well. He had been treating her for some time, and he had knowledge about the other people and the things that were happening in her life. So Freud, being Freud, digs deeper. And what he comes up with is classic Freud. You'll see what I mean. Okay, so first, he looks at what happened the day before she had the dream, for what he calls the day residue. Now, this is what Freud calls the very recent things that happened during the day that show up in our dreams later that night. Or in Freud's own words, instigation to a dream is always to be found in the previous day's event. Well, in this case, it turns out this married woman's husband, a local butcher, had just told her that he was going to go on a diet and wouldn't be accepting any more dinner invitations. That's the trigger. That's the instigating incident or the day residue that the dream is working with. But here's where it gets interesting. Through talking to her, Freud uncovers that in real life, this very same patient, the married woman, has a very thin friend who had been wanting to gain weight. Not only that, her thin friend had been asking when she will be invited over to their home for dinner again. And here's the best part. The married woman's husband, the butcher on a diet, was known to prefer full-figured women. And allegedly, he had been praising the wife's thin friend. Okay, so in real talk, the married woman's husband had the hots for her thin friend, the same friend who had been wanting to gain weight. And if he was already attracted to her while she was thin, he would be even more attracted to her if she ate more food and gained weight, right? Since it was well known that he liked full-figured women. This whole dream is like Victorian era gossip. I feel like ridiculous just talking about it. But anyway, now the dream makes perfect sense, right? Freud's patient, the married woman, was feeling insecure about her marriage and didn't want to invite her friend over and feed her because the implication is her friend would gain weight and develop a fuller figure, which would make her more attractive to her husband than she already was. The jealousy, the rivalry, the insecurity, it's all there, expressed through the language of food. The dream fulfills the patient's wish by creating a scenario where she cannot feed her friend because she doesn't have enough food to host a supper party. And here's the best part. Remember how in the dream, the married woman only had smoked salmon at home? Well, it turns out that smoked salmon is her thin friend's favorite food. That's the nail in the coffin for Freud's point. Dream symbols aren't universal. You can't look them up in some dream dictionary. It was very specific to the married woman's situation and her unconscious emotions towards her friend that she didn't want to confront. If you or I dreamt about smoked salmon, it would be something completely different. This is some pretty good detective work by Freud, right? I mean, Freud has taken what looks like a wish denial dream and shown that it's actually wish fulfillment in disguise. But then, and this is so typical of early Freud, he can't just leave it at that. He has to add another layer of theory. He starts talking about hysterical identification. Now, let me break this down because I spent way too long trying to understand what he was on about. And this is a great example of Freud's tendency to overcomplicate things. Okay, so according to Freud, the patient, the married woman, is unconsciously identifying with her friend, the thin friend. The friend wants to eat more and gain weight. The patient dreams about wanting to host but can't provide food. He calls this hysterical identification, a term that in his era meant one person unconsciously developing the same symptoms as another person they're emotionally entangled with. But here's the thing, by Freud's own definition, hysterical identification requires the formation of shared symptoms between two people. Like, okay, so if two women were rivals and one developed a limp, the other might unconsciously develop a psychosomatic limp too. That's what hysterical identification means in the clinical sense he was using it in 1900s Vienna. But that's not what's happening here, right? I mean, the married woman isn't developing an eating disorder or food-related symptoms. She's jealous. She dreams about it. And then the dream expresses that rivalry through food symbolism. There's no shared psychological or physiological symptoms, just a straightforward case of jealousy and insecurity. So I can't help but feel like Freud was stretching his own theorizing to fit a case that didn't need it. His earlier explanation already covered everything really well. He didn't need to throw in this fancy label. He could have just said the dream reflects unconscious rivalry expressed as symbolic denial, and it would have been cleaner, tighter, and honestly more convincing. This case shows exactly what I've been noticing throughout my reading of Freud. His actual insights are often brilliant. Like, he correctly identifies the jealousy, the rivalry, the way our unconscious minds use symbolism to express what we can't admit directly. So when he's doing psychological detective work, tracking down our unconscious wishes, our hidden wishes through symbolic clues, he is on fire. Now, I'm just speculating here, but I wonder if maybe he felt pressure to show everyone like how brilliant he was or how revolutionary psychoanalysis was. So he would try to like over-explain things to like really convince people. I mean, he was up against a medical establishment that thought like everything was malingering or just women's nerves. It was like a really misogynistic time, and that the unconscious was just like pure quackery. In turn of the century, Vienna was obsessed with medical prestige. So to be taken seriously against neurologists and psychiatrists, he couldn't just say dreams are like Victorian gossip in disguise. Plus, he was staking his professional identity on this book, so it would kind of make sense if he felt that way. But then he weakens his own arguments by over-theorizing. He takes something clear and makes it muddy by adding unnecessary clinical jargon and like applying a diagnosis where it doesn't even apply. It's like if I showed you how a magic trick works and then insisted on calling it prestigital misdirection via ocular displacement and then diagnosed the audience with glaucoma instead of just saying sleight of hand. That doesn't make it more convincing. It just makes it harder to follow and easier to criticize. If Freud had just said, this dream expresses unconscious rivalry through symbolic denial, it would have been perfect, clean, clear, and psychologically sound. But like he had to dress it up in diagnostic language that, even by his own standards, didn't quite apply, and where it didn't even seem to meet the diagnostic criteria. Here's what really gets me. The chapter is called Distortion in Dreams, and Freud is explaining how our wishes get distorted by internal censorship before they can even appear in dreams. But you know what else has been distorted? Freud's entire theory and his reputation. In popular culture, Freud has been reduced to sometimes a cigar is just a cigar, which I don't think he ever even said that. But other things, everything is about sex. And if you dream about a train, it's because you want to sleep with your mother. It's like the public understanding of Freud went through its own censorship process. And what came out on the other side was this cartoonish oversimplification of who he really was. And I'll admit, when it came to dreams, I used to think that too. I always lumped dream interpretation in with astrology and horoscopes, vague one-size-fits-all readings that could be applied to anyone. Like those dream dictionaries where a snake means a penis or a cave means a vagina and flying means sex. Total hogwash, malarkey, and I stand by that. I still think that about those dream dictionaries. But that's not what Freud is actually arguing here. He's saying that dreams are deeply personal, that the same symbol can mean completely different things to completely different people, and that the distortion itself is where the meaning lies. The smoked salmon isn't universally significant. It matters because it's the friend's favorite food. The inability to host a dinner party isn't a general symbol of frustration. It matters because it prevents a specific rival from becoming more attractive to her husband. The symbols are personal, contextual, and rooted in individual experience and relationships. So yeah, reading about dream distortion and symbolism has actually really changed my view on the meanings of dreams. It's interesting that the book is called The Interpretation of Dreams. I feel like if it had been called The Examination of Dreams, that would have been more fitting, because it's kind of like the Socratic idea of examining one's life, right? That seems to be what Freud is actually arguing. We examine our dreams, because in English, at least in English, interpretation kind of has this connotation. It's been associated with things like interpreting tarot cards or reading tarot cards or reading your horoscope, and I feel like examining would have fit better. I wonder if that's something that maybe got lost in translation from German to English. But anyways, what do you all think? Does thinking about dreams as disguised wishes that have to sneak past internal censorship, does that change how you understand your own dreams? Anyway, if you're still watching, thank you so much for watching. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe. And my name is Vince, and I'll see you in the next one. Okay, so one night, Freud dreams about becoming a professor. And in the dream, he sees two of his former colleagues and mentors, Dr. Joseph Breuer and Dr. Theodore Maynard. But what's weird is that they're both depicted in really degrading ways in the dream. Breuer appears as a simpleton and Maynard as a criminal. Now, if you or I had a dream about a criminal or a simpleton, it could symbolize something completely different. But with Freud, he knew exactly what he was really dreaming about. See, at the time he had the dream, in real life, Freud was angling for a professorship at the University of Vienna, where he used to be a student. And he was already teaching, as what we would call today a lecturer, but he wanted to get a position as a full professor. But up until that point, he had been unable to get the job. And he was also in competition with some of his friends and colleagues, who all wanted the same position. So Freud felt really insecure about this. He felt that maybe he wasn't the best applicant for the job and some of his colleagues deserved it more than he did. By this time, he had also had fallings out with Breuer and Maynard, and he was no longer on good terms with them. This made them prime material for his unconscious to project onto. And that's why they appeared in the dream as stand-ins for his current colleagues who were competing against him for the same job and who Freud was likely still on good terms with. Now, here's the brilliant part. So Freud realizes the degradation of Breuer and Maynard in his dream was actually wish fulfillment in disguise. Freud isn't wishing his friends were criminals and simpletons, but by making his colleagues look unworthy, the dream is secretly arguing that Freud deserves the professorship more than they do, that he was the stronger candidate for the position. And here's the key. It's not that the wish itself is monstrous. It's that it's vain and narcissistic. Wanting to see himself as more deserving than his friends was egotistical and self-serving, and that was inconsistent with how Freud saw himself. That was far too distressing for his conscious mind to admit. That's why the dream had to disguise it, to get Freud to accept something about himself that he had been avoiding. The degradation of his colleagues wasn't the wish, it was the camouflage. The real wish was simple. I deserve the professorship, not my friends. I'm better than them.